a real name. And I started to ponder what it meant. And the more I pondered, the more I decided that maybe it was the kind of thing that would be happier if it got out of my head, or it was slowly driving me mad. And into all of yours. It's called In Rèilig Odhrain. And Rèilig Odhrain is it's a graveyard on the island of Iona on the west of Scotland. And it's the island and the graveyard in which many of the kings of Scotland, not to mention Ireland and Norway, are buried. And it's named after St. Odhrain. And this is the story of St. Odhrain. When St. Columba landed on the island of Iona, his friend Odhrain landed with him. Though some say St. Odhrain waited in the shadows of the island, waiting for the saint to land there, I believe they came together, came from Ireland, were like brothers, for the blonde and brave Columba, and the dark man they call Odhrain. He was Odhrain, like the otter was the other. There were others, and they landed on Iona, and they said, we'll build a chapel. It's what saints did when they landed. Odhrain, priest of sun or fire, or from Ora, meaning dark-haired. But their chapel kept on crumbling, and Columba took the answer from a dream or revelation that his building needed Odhrain, needed death in the foundations. Others claim it was doctrinal, and St. Odhrain and Columba were debating, as the Irish love debating, about heaven. Since the truth is long forgotten, we are left with just their actions. By their actions shall ye know them. St. Columba buried Odhrain, still alive, with earth about him, buried deep, with earth upon him. 3 days later, they returned there, stocky monks with spades and mattocks, and they dug down to St. Odhrain so Columba could embrace him, touch his face and say his farewells. 3 days dead, they brushed the mud off, when St. Odhrain's eyes blinked open. Odhrain grinned at St. Columba. He had died, but now has risen. And he said the words the dead know, in a voice like wind and water. He said, heaven is not waiting for the good and pure and gentle. There's no punishment eternal. There's no hell for the ungodly, nor is God as you imagine. St. Columba shouted, quiet! And to save the monks from error, shoveled mud onto St. Odhrain. So they buried him forever. And they called the place St. Odhrain's. In its churchyard, kings of Scotland, kings of Norway, all were buried on the island of Iona. Some folk claim it was a druid priest of sunlight that was buried in the earth of good Iona, just to hold the church foundations, but for me that's much too simple. And it libels St. Columba, who cried, earth, throw earth on Odhrain, stop his mouth with mud this moment, lest he bring us to perdition. They imagine it a murder, as one saint entombed another underneath that holy chapel. While St. Odhrain's name continues, martyred heretic, his bones still hold the chapel stones together, and we join them, kings and princes, in his graveyard, in his chapel, for it's Odhrain's name they carry. He's embraced in his damnation by the simple words he uttered. There's no hell to spite the sinners. There's no heaven for the blessed. God is not what you imagine. And perhaps he kept on preaching, for he died and he had risen, until silenced, crushed or muffled by the soil of Iona. St. Columba, he was buried on the island of Iona decades later. But they disinterred his body and they took it to Downpatrick, where it's buried with St. Patrick and St. Bridget, so the only saint is Odhrain on the island of Iona. Don't go digging in that graveyard for the kings of old, the mighty, or archbishops and their riches. They are guarded by St. Odhrain, who will rise up from the graveyard like the darkness, like an otter, for he sees the sun no longer. He will touch you, he will taste you, he will leave his words inside you. God is not what you imagine, nor is hell, and nor is heaven. Then you'll leave him and his graveyard, and forget the shadow's terror. As you rub your neck, remember only this: he died to save us, and that St. Columba killed him.